Week 3 mini lecture, Thinking Like a Sociologist, From Crime Data to Sociological Thinking. This is Maricela Mendoza for the course SOC244, Sociological Criminology. This week, we are moving through 3 levels of sociological thinking. First, we describe the evidence from data sources, the Uniform Crime Reports, or UCR, and the National Crime Victimization Survey, NCVS. Secondly, we interpret that evidence. Lastly, we explain the evidence. We explain the patterns sociologically. As we have seen from both sources, data are more than just numbers. In sociology, we are interested in how data tell us a story about society. Data tell us a story about society. We are concerned and interested in the methodology of the data. That is, how the data is collected. As sociologists, we're just as interested in how the data were collected as we are in the numbers themselves. So before we understand that whole story, that story about society, we have to ask about the specifics of the data collection methodology. This includes asking what the data include, what they exclude, and then how those methodological decisions shape our understanding of crime and society. Let's talk about those 2 data sources. First, I want to highlight that both the UCR and the NCVS are valuable sources of empirical data. Together, this information, the information that they yield, the information helps us identify and describe crime patterns. It helps us identify and describe victimization trends, as well as changes across time and place. And this includes rises and declines in specific types of crimes, as well as crime rates. Also, each one of these 2 sources, as we have discussed this week, each of these sources has methodological limitations, and these limitations influence the story the data tell us. As sociology students, I want to emphasize this question. So here's my sociological question to you. Is this the whole story when we're looking at the data and these numbers? As many students have already noted, the UCR depends on crimes being reported to and recorded by law enforcement. On the other hand, the NCVS relies on victims' willingness and ability to report their experiences in a household survey. Note that we have identified barriers to completing that survey, as well as barriers to sampling all groups in society. The unhoused and runaway teens, for instance, are excluded from that survey most of the time. Understanding these details and these differences is important. So understanding these 2 components is important. But for sociologists, this is where the work really begins. Conclusion and connections. As you continue to participate in this discussion after that first step, after describing the evidence in the data sources and what each of the 2 sources do, I want to encourage you to move simply beyond simply identifying the strengths and weaknesses of the UCR and the NCVS. So again, we are moving away from simply identifying those strengths and weaknesses from that first level of sociological thinking. And many of you have already done an excellent job at identifying and discussing those strengths and limitations. However, sociologists take the next step after collecting data from the social world by asking what those data sources tell us, by asking, what do they reveal to us about society? Why do certain crime patterns emerge? Who is missing? Who is missing from our measurements? How might the way we measure crime influence how law enforcement follow up on a crime? How does measurement shape public opinion? How does measurement shape criminal justice policy? Let's look at a few examples as we are now in that second level, which is interpreting the data and then asking these questions and then explaining. So it's the bridge between the second and the third level. Let's imagine that you selected a case involving domestic violence. If this is the term in which we are addressing a selected real world case or crime for your midterm. So let's imagine that you selected a case involving domestic violence or intimate partner violence, as sociologists also describe it or label it. Taking into consideration one of the trends from the data sources, if many victims never report this type of abuse to the police, and some victims are reluctant to disclose victimization on surveys, does that mean that domestic violence is uncommon? Or does it suggest something else, something about fear, stigma, unequal power within relationships, economic dependence, or barriers to reporting? In other words, sociologists want to ask more questions to get a fuller story. We want to know, what does the absence of data reveal about society, not just about crime? I will repeat that again. Sociologists want to ask more questions so we can get a fuller story, a complete picture. We want to know, what does the absence of data reveal about society, or the way data is collected, what does it reveal about society, not just about crime? Now let's consider another case, one involving white-collar crime. Because these offenses are often underrepresented in official crime statistics, and they receive different patterns of enforcement than violent crimes, sociologists have a few questions to ask. If white-collar crime is underrepresented in official statistics, what kinds of images of crime are reinforced through media coverage? Who becomes viewed as the typical criminal? And who escapes public attention? How might those perceptions influence criminal justice policy, or funding priorities, or public opinion about white-collar crime? Lastly, the questions I'm asking in my follow-up replies this week and in this mini lecture are intentionally similar to the kinds of questions you will be required to address on part 4 of the midterm, or whichever component of that midterm, depending on the term, or just in this class in general, because I do switch out assignments. So this follow-up lecture is similar to questions that you will be required to address in some form or another in this course. So while understanding the strengths and limitations of these data sources, the UCR and the NCVS, this understanding is important. However, I am even more interested in your ability to use data to think like a sociologist. Notice how each week in the course is building on the previous week. In week 1, we learned to think sociologically about crime. We introduced C. Wright Mills into the course and the sociological imagination. In week 2, we examined how media shape public perceptions of crime. This week, we're asking how the way we measure crime also shapes what we think we know about crime. These are the same connections you'll be making in the midterm or at other points throughout the term. Sociology and a sociological understanding to criminology asks us to move beyond simply describing, but asking what, for example, the data might reveal about society, but also about human behavior around crime. Anyone can report what data and the numbers say. Sociologists, on the other hand, ask why the numbers look the way they do. Sociologists ask, what are the methodological approaches, the data collection approaches, the methodology behind gathering social facts from the social world? We ask how they were collected, whose experiences are represented, whose are missing, and what those patterns reveal about sociology. What they reveal about society. As you likely already know, And whether or not this is your first sociology course, sociology asks us to ask more and more questions. When we develop a hypothesis and then collect data from the social world and then address that hypothesis, we are often left with even more questions than we began with. And that, as C. Wright Mills says, might be both the terrible lesson and the magnificent lesson of sociology. That's all for this mini lecture.